But mysteriously, he was banned by the UK government led by Keir Starmer. Now, this sort of censorious and increasingly tyrannical behavior is becoming pervasive in the United Kingdom, as most of my audience that watches this channel from the UK knows all too well. Camus believed that the combination of these two forces, the radical anti-racists on the one hand, on the left, and the vulture capitalists on the right, had colluded in this conspiracy of sorts called the Great Replacement. But the point is that Western society is on edge because we're entering into a feedback loop in which Western governments are losing control. What's happening is we are gelling into a bifurcation. Either you support globalism or you are a nationalist. That's the way I would frame it. And that is a kind of political dichotomy that we can win. Welcome back to Men and the City. I hope all of you are doing well. In today's video, we're going to talk about a controversial topic called the Great Replacement, an idea, a concept that's gaining increasing momentum in the Western world, and one that my guess is most of you are familiar with. So today's video is going to be called No Going Back. Something interesting happened in the United Kingdom earlier this year. A French intellectual named Renaud Camus was banned from entering the United Kingdom, where he was scheduled to give a speech addressing immigration and presumably to debate the subject during his time there.
This is a big story in the newspapers today. A French philosopher, a French novelist known for his anti-immigration views, has been banned from entering the UK. Renaud Camus was denied travel authorization by the Home Office under the new Electronic Travel Authorization Scheme, and an email response stated, "Your presence in the UK is not considered to be conducive to the public good." Meanwhile, earlier this year, a convicted Syrian terrorist was allowed to stay in the UK after police backed their asylum claim, while 30,000 small-boat illegal migrants, we don't know who they are, we don't know what they believe, we don't know what they've been involved in the past, have crossed into the UK since Keir Starmer and the Labour government came to power.
But mysteriously, he was banned by the UK government led by Keir Starmer. Now, this sort of censorious and increasingly tyrannical behavior is becoming pervasive in the United Kingdom, as most of my audience that watches this channel from the UK knows all too well. But this banning is interesting. Why is it interesting? Because Renaud Camus is the originator of the term Great Replacement.
He was simply looking for a term that would describe what is visibly going on in Europe. So Great Replacement, it holds the same kind of meaning as something like the Great Plague or the Great Depression. Terms simply to describe what is most salient and obvious about our era, which is what he calls the change of people and civilization, which, if you look into European demographics over the last 30, 40 years, is simply a statistical fact.
Now, a little bit of background on Renaud Camus. Renaud Camus is a French intellectual who actually became famous and came to prominence in France for writing books about homosexuality, one of which I believe is called Tricks. However, he eventually left Paris and moved to the countryside, where he began to notice what Americans, Canadians, Germans, Frenchmen, his countrymen, etc., are beginning to notice that it doesn't look quite the same now, does it? So Camus found himself meandering in the nearby markets where he lived, and he noticed lots of people from Middle Eastern or North African descent were increasingly living there and displacing the population, the native-born Frenchmen, who had lived there for generations. And this struck him as odd, and like the rest of us, he began to explore exactly what was happening. How could such a drastic demographic change occur? And he came up with a couple different explanations. The first was a wave of anti-racism that really got off the ground in the 1960s. Now, anti-racism as a movement, as I think most of us know, has its origins in the aftermath of the Second War. After World War II and the crimes of Nazism or National Socialism and the defeat of Germany and the subsequent blame of the German state for everything that had happened, there was a reaction to that, particularly in Anglo countries, but across Western Europe, against all of the policies, the thinking, the philosophies associated with the Nazi Party in Germany and the Axis powers. That was the first wave. And that wave, according to Camus, was primarily focused on protecting certain minorities or protecting minority rights in general. However, there was a second wave, and that second wave wasn't so much about protecting minority rights or learning the lessons, if you will, of the Second War, as much as it was a kind of venomous self-hatred, a vitriol directed at Western peoples, full stop, at Frenchmen, Germans, Americans, Canadians, etc., etc. And I suppose this sentiment can be captured in a quote that comes from a leftist critic in the United States by the name of Susan Sontag, who said, quote, "The white race is a cancer of human history," end quote. So it was this kind of weaponized anti-racism, if you will, that Camus felt was the primary instigator of this mass immigration, this deluge of peoples that were coming into France, and disarming any resistance to that. Because obviously, if you resisted, you were a racist, and nobody would want to be called a racist.
I mean, his views, the Great Replacement theory, is a racist, inciting theory that has been used by terrorists. It's been cited by terrorists, for example, the Christchurch mosque shooter in 2019, the El Paso Walmart shooter, both cited the Great Replacement theory.
In fairness to Camus, though, he would say he strongly disavowed all of that.
Of course he would.
The second component, however, was perhaps just as potent, although not psychological as much as monetarily driven, and this was the interests of capitalist finance. And that is to say that the corporate entities across the Western world advocated for open borders as an expedient economic policy. And so you had a guest worker program with Turkey in Germany. You had Commonwealth immigration in the United Kingdom, which granted citizenship to non-Britons that were part of former colonies in the British Empire. Of course, in the United States, we had a similar change with the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965 and subsequent waves of immigration that gradually acquired political power and the sort of explosion of victim economics and politics and all the rest of it, things that I think most of you are familiar with. In any case, Camus believed that the combination of these two forces, the radical anti-racists on the one hand, on the left, and the vulture capitalists on the right, had colluded in this conspiracy of sorts called the Great Replacement. Now, if you go on Wikipedia or you Google the Great Replacement in general, you search for it on YouTube, what you'll find is that this is deemed a sort of right-wing conspiracy. But as I said, Renaud Camus was anything but that.
As for his biography, he was born in the 1940s in the city of Clermont-Ferrand, which is central France. He came to prominence as a noted homosexual writer, actually. In 1979, he published a book called Tricks. That's the only thing before us that was ever translated into English. So he was known as a kind of, gay activist. He was very much a Mitterrand-era socialist, a man of the left who was connected with all the right circles.
And furthermore, his contention was that there was no Great Replacement theory, there was a Great Replacement fact. And I think the statistics bear that out. It's unassailable at this point, but that's exactly why Renaud Camus was banned from the United Kingdom, because something is happening across Europe and the United States, and that is that we are beginning to hit critical mass, a critical mass in which the sort of collective psyche of Western peoples is increasingly alarmed at the volume of foreigners, at the volume of displacement, at the degeneracy, if you will, of the native-born population across the Western world. But there's more. Camus' assertion, though I think it's correct in a superficial sense, is opening the door to broader questions about exactly what is happening in the West. And to address this point, I want to reference a very good article written by Keith Woods called Protestantism, Jews, and Wokeness. Because while Camus made a compelling case, to be sure, he shied away from going any deeper and basically argued that from the 1960s forward, the combination of these two forces really explains more or less what's happened. And of course, I think most of us know that that's not the full story now, is it? Now, I'm not going to go into all of the intellectual underpinnings and the banking interests and so forth that are at play that brought us to this point. But I do want to acknowledge that what's happening because of Camus, among other current events, is that doors are opening, minds are increasingly aware to the other side of the coin. In other words, the deeper interests that are at work that are sort of engineering the demise of the West. So in this paper, Protestantism, Jews, and Wokeness, Keith Woods does a good job of refuting the notion that this sort of radical egalitarianism, anti-racism, communist sort of thinking has anything to do with Western culture, society, etc., etc. In other words, it's completely inorganic. And listen to what he has to say here. When we talk about wokeism, and wokeism is sort of the catch-all term to describe all of these things that Camus touched on, it's obviously the 20th century that really matters. At the beginning of the 20th century, American Christians still took for granted things like natural race differences, segregation, and restrictions on pornography. Progressives of the time championed Darwinism and eugenics. It was later in the 20th century, with the rise of Boasian anthropology, and especially the rise of a new Jewish-dominated elite in the 1960s, in critical areas of American life, like the social sciences and the media, that the character of progressivism changed to adopt the characteristics of wokeism today. Blank slateism, anti-white enmity, pluralism, relativism, sexual liberation, etc. He continues, it would be difficult to find any agreement on a list of the 100 figures most responsible for the intellectual currents that shaped wokeism. But we can imagine a few names that would have to feature for the list to be authoritative. We could include multiple members of the Jewish Frankfurt School. Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, who birthed critical theory and its many offshoots. Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies did as much as any book to shape the character of post-war liberalism with its emphasis on pluralism and minoritarianism. And surely warrants him a spot. Gail Rubin would have to feature as the founder of queer theory, as would Leslie Feinberg, one of the first leftists to promote the idea of transgender liberation to a significant audience. Judith Butler is credited with being the first to popularize the gender is a social construct idea, while France Boas, Ashley Montagu, and Claude Levi-Strauss deserve a large share of credit for popularizing the ideas of racial egalitarianism the left take for granted today. So in that brief paragraph or two, he already elucidates a lot of the progenitors of the anti-racist radicalism that Camus talks about. The key takeaway here, folks, and the reason why this is so important in my view, and exposes to some degree the foundations under which the legacy regimes in the West, which absolutely represent the union of these two forces, financial interests on the one hand. Now he sort of associates them with the right. I wouldn't necessarily do so, but let's just leave that there for the moment. And then the anti-racism of the left, that absolutely represents a union that dominates every government in the Western world. Doesn't matter whether it's Donald Trump in office, or it's Boris Johnson, or it's Emmanuel Macron. It simply doesn't matter. root and branch, all of them are dominated more or less by those forces. However, the reason why Renaud Camus was banned is because over the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years, several breakthroughs intellectually, mentally, spiritually are happening psychologically in the West. The first being that just as Camus noticed that things were sort of awry demographically, people across the Western world recognize that things are not working, that the standard of living is not rising, that it's falling, that crime is not minimal as it was in the past, that it's ubiquitous, that it's increasingly violent, that the social trust in society has broken down. And obviously that foreign displacement of the native-born population is everywhere. It's not localized to big cities. It's not an urban phenomenon like it used to be. It is absolutely universal. And the second realization from that is a kind of race realism, the recognition that there are absolutely differences between different racial groups, that those differences are substantial and decisive, and that they explain the diversity of mankind, that they explain the differences between the first world and the third world, between Western societies and non-Western societies. Indeed, we are incubating those differences inside our countries. This is what Camus noticed. That's the second. And the third is that the sort of globalist, anti-racist radicalism, the wokeness, etc., are largely dominated, indeed spearheaded, by this sort of Zionist Jewish intellectualism.
It's the ideological one which is the most important, the ideological, the intellectual and the spiritual that are lying beneath all the other reasons, that really we have to destroy these ideological roots of the globalist liberal system that is promoting this immigration. They want to create a world without borders, without rules, without laws.
Now, my point in saying all of this is that Renaud Camus is obviously no right-wing intellectual. In fact, he's a left-wing intellectual. And you might even say that he sort of betrayed his left-wing class by saying the things that he's done, that he has.
He really, in some ways, is guilty of being a class traitor to his artistic or his social caste for pointing out these demographic changes.
But the point is that Western society is on edge because we're entering into a feedback loop in which Western governments are losing control. They're not just losing control of propaganda, of the narrative, of the opinions on the street. They're losing control politically. They're losing control economically. And that's why Renaud Camus was banned. Now, I say this in part topically because there was just a Remigration Summit held by some interesting people in Europe, one of whom is Martin Sellner.
We want to preserve our cultural continuity because right now with the replacement migration going on like that, in a few decades, this city will be completely different. In Vienna, my city where I come from, the majority of pupils are now Muslims. Just fast forward 10, 20 years. And people can be Muslims. I have nothing against Muslims. But there are 56 Muslim countries worldwide. And Austria, Italy, Germany don't need to become more Muslim countries. That's all we say, and that's why we need remigration. Thank you to Salvini and Meloni that they don't block me from entering. I love Italy. It's an amazing country, and I love the Italian culture. And we are also here to keep the Italian culture like it is, because it's a beautiful country and it should stay Italian. We have ideas, and we don't care which political party takes these ideas and puts them into reality. We are a patriotic NGO. That's what we are, a lobby for remigration.
Now, this Remigration Summit, which is a broadly supported summit by European right-wing thinkers across the continent, led by people like Martin Sellner in Austria, but there are Dutch participants, Italian participants. In fact, I think the summit was held in Italy. In other words, there is a new consensus emerging, not just in Europe, but in the United States as well. We see this expressed in the candidacy of Donald Trump, even if his administration is a fraud and a failure, and I certainly think that it is. It simply doesn't matter. This idea, these ideas, these breakthroughs are gaining momentum and intensity. And the Remigration Summit is yet another expression of that. And it's happening outside of the political process, which for all intents and purposes just doesn't matter anymore. And that brings me to the final point here. There is a fourth voice that I've talked about before, rooted in the sort of financial demolition that's happening in the Western world.
This voice, I call it the fourth voice in the French parliament. You know, we have three blocks, center, far right, and the left. And I think the fourth voice now is going to be the bond market.
Now, I know a lot of you believe that this is planned. I absolutely do not think it is planned whatsoever. And secondly, the financial collapse, you might say the reset in the West, is paving the way for all of these underlying forces that are privy to the Great Replacement, that feel an existential dread because of the Great Replacement. It's going to kick that into hyperdrive. There is no turning back, in other words, from this sort of state of no return, this state of awareness that we reach. Now, in conclusion, I think it's noteworthy that Camus decidedly rejected the moniker of being a right-wing thinker at all. He also rejected the notion that there was a broader conspiracy behind the Great Replacement. As I said, his view is that this sort of naturally unfolded as you got the extremism of anti-racist thinking that comes out of the 60s, but really has its roots in the outcome of World War II. And then on the other hand, it was a function of financial capitalism. It was simply an economic model. Not that there was anything more to it, but obviously there is. His attempt to delineate between the two hasn't served him well. He was banned from the United Kingdom regardless. And that's the point here, folks, is that increasingly the situation politically, economically, socially, culturally, racially is binary. You're either in support of the continued Great Replacement and the demolition of the West demographically and otherwise, or you oppose it. And it doesn't much matter how you oppose it. It doesn't matter whether you are an aging homosexual former French socialist like Camus on the one hand, or you're Martin Sellner and you're promoting a Remigration Summit on the other. These differences simply don't matter anymore, and what's happening is we are gelling into a bifurcation. Either you support globalism or you are a nationalist. That's the way I would frame it. And that is a kind of political dichotomy that we can win. It will address, it will throw into sharp relief in a furious fashion all the problems that bedevil us in the Western world, whether you're in Spain, or you're in Austria, or you're in the United Kingdom, or you're in the United States, or you're in Canada, or you're in Australia. It just doesn't much matter. But they banned Camus because the legacy structure is increasingly sensitive to this loss of control, politically, socially, economically, culturally, etc., etc., etc. The old consensus, the old guard is breaking down, and a new consensus is emergent. That's why Camus was banned. It is not going to succeed. In fact, it's going to amplify his message. And it's going to force this sort of simplification of the political landscape in ways that no longer obfuscate what's really going on. In other words, the sort of controlled opposition of the faux right, if you want to call it that, is evaporating.
Tim Pool is too much of a coward to actually just come out and say that. So he has to hint around, oh, they think these like Jews run the world, et cetera, et cetera. So he can't just like come out and say that, you know?
And that is a powerful step in the right direction. Stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.